Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Life in the Fast Lane, Distractions Behind the Wheel and Everywhere Else, sponsored by SafeStart. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speaker and his organization are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorse them. At the end of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. You can feel free to ask your question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but due to the large number of participants today, we may not get to all of the questions. However, all unanswered questions not answered during the presentation will be forwarded on to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the presentation concludes. This webcast is archived so you can access it after today's live presentation. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, I think we're ready to begin. Our speaker today is Danny Smith, the Senior SafeStart Consultant. Danny has performed safety consultations for a wide range of industries on a variety of topics, including advanced awareness techniques to combat distracted driving. Danny?
Thank you, Kyle, and welcome, everybody. As we go through this session today, I want to begin by focusing our attention on the issue that we're currently facing. We're going to look at, some of the sources and types of distractions, which in turn will help us better understand the true cause. Additionally, we'll close with what I would suggest is a cure for combating the issue, which will be much more effective than what most organizations are currently using. Let's begin to think a bit about the different types of at-risk behavior that we see in most situations, and specifically here we want to apply these to driving. First of all, we tend to think of those things which we would classify as what we could call deliberate at-risk behavior. If you look at the graphic here, we see someone that's driving, about 80, 85 miles an hour. Now, unless that's a case where you're on a long drive and perhaps your speed gradually crept up over time while you were on autopilot, for example, this could be more than likely intentional and deliberate. And certainly that would be the case if instead of autopilot you had the cruise control set at that speed. We also would look at things that we would classify as habitual at-risk behavior. These are things like forgetting to check your blind spots or your mirrors, or not using the turn signals, which some people tend to do habitually as well. And then we would finally look at what we would call those unintentional at-risk behaviors. This would be things like running through a stoplight that, honest to goodness, you just didn't see until you were halfway through the intersection. Maybe missing a stoplight as well could go into that. Now, we're not talking about the yellow light here that you were trying to beat, or the one that was maybe just a shade of pink. We're talking about the ones that, honestly, you didn't see until you were part of the way through the intersection. Or maybe another driver brought it to your attention, maybe even signaled to you that you were number one. Now, statistically, the number of deaths in the U.S. due to on-the-road accidents, according to the injury facts from the NSC, is around 33,000 per year. And that number varies year to year, 32, 33, 34,000, but it's fairly consistently high at that number. And if we look at some numbers from the Centers for Disease Control, I know this isn't the topic we're talking about, but you'll see the transition here in a moment. About 31% of these, they tell us, are alcohol-related. And that hit really, really close to home with me and my family back on February the 11th of 2011. I live in central Alabama, and I had gone up to New York to do a job for a client there for a couple of weeks. My wife came up at the end of the second week. We were planning on going down to New York City for the first part of that weekend and spend the weekend in the city. About 8:30 that Friday evening, we got a call from my son-in-law, Travis, that you see here in this picture. Travis is married to my middle daughter, Tiffany, and Travis told us that Tiffany had been in a very, very serious accident that evening on her way home from work here in Birmingham. She was driving home on a four-lane highway in her brown Jeep Grand Cherokee. It's represented by the bottom left corner of your screen there. A friend of ours just happened at random to be right ahead of her in a small, little smaller red pickup truck. And then on the far side of the highway, going the opposite direction, was a gentleman in a big F-150 truck who he'd already had a few too many that evening, shall we say. He bounced off the guardrail over on the right-hand side of the highway, crossed 2 lanes of traffic heading back the opposite direction my daughter was coming from, jumped through the median, hit our friend David right into the rear quarter panel of his truck, spun him around a few times, and then the next thing that happened was his truck went straight into the path of my daughter's SUV. And pretty much, as you can see from the picture of the front end of his truck, hit her head on. This, by the way, is what was left of his truck after the accident. And this was the front of my daughter's Jeep. Very fortunate for us, though, we also have this next picture. Keep in mind, we're about 600 or 800 miles away from home when we get the phone call that this happened. Not a phone call you want to get when you're down the street, much less if you're that far away from home. At first, Tiffany thought that she'd been cut really, really badly. She was wet all over, and she realized that it was a Diet Coke that she had in her console that had splashed all over, and that none of the wet was red, so everything was good there. They took her to the hospital. They did the X-rays, the CAT scans, the MRIs, all of that. Checked her out completely. Miraculously, no broken bones, no internal injuries. We were so fortunate that evening that she was not taken away from us, quite honestly, and that she was not seriously injured. And by the way, since we do have this picture here, and we were so fortunate that evening that she survived this, well, now I have this next picture. This is Tiffany now, along with Carson. Carson's going to be our first grandson. He's scheduled to arrive in July. When I think about the idea of driving under the influence of that thing, it also relates back to somewhat of what we talked about before. That's a kind of a deliberate at-risk behavior, if you will. But what I'm beginning to find is that some of the other things we're seeing are beginning to shift over into the realm of not just deliberate at-risk behavior, which is what we traditionally think of when we think of things like driving and texting or driving and using a cell phone. I begin to see that it's beginning to affect us in a lot of ways, and these are actually becoming quite habitual now for many of us. Now, a little bit more background on that story. We talked to her, asked if we should come home. She said, no, I'm fine. In fact, she said, they've given me pain medicine, and I'm going to bed for a few days because I'm extremely sore right now and hurting. So we stayed on, and I was doing okay with this until the middle of that next week when, well, this slide came up in the middle of a presentation I was doing in front of a class, and I just broke down. When I got to thinking about that 31% there, of the folks who die accidentally from alcohol-related injuries, just the simple math hit me at that point. And I began to think about the 69% that was left and what was causing that to happen. And quite honestly, folks, that's when I began diving deeper into the subject of distracted driving, because I honestly believe a lot of that does come back to the idea of distracted driving, and particularly that it's not just a deliberate at-risk behavior that we're seeing, but we're also, I believe, beginning to see many of these things become very, very habitual for many of us as we're behind the wheel, and for many of our friends, our families, and our coworkers. So as we begin this today, just mention that it is becoming a very habitual thing for most folks. If you look at a recent survey from the CDC, they found that 31% of drivers age 18 to 64, so it's not just a young people problem, if you will, had read or sent a text or an email while driving over the last 30 days. And they estimate that there's been over 3,300 people killed in that 1 year due to distracted driving deaths, and almost 400,000 that were injured. So it's just amazing that we see the magnitude of this issue. Now, as safety professionals, what we typically think of any time that we try to address a situation, whatever it is we tend to go back to our traditional hierarchy of controls. Let's take that real quickly, if we can, and apply that over to the idea of distracted driving. Because I think what we're trying is a tried and true approach, but it may not necessarily work in this case. Or at least the idea that it's working may only be to a certain measure. So one of the things we think of traditionally is we look at elimination or substitution. And, even though the science fiction writers of the 50s were expecting the flying cars by now, and we're hearing more and more about cars which are driving themselves, although I understand they're having quite a few problems with those right now, we don't seem to be eliminating the automobile or people being behind the wheel of the automobile at this point. So that one's still a bit of a ways away. We also look next at things like engineering controls. And if we apply that to driving, well, yes, we do have some things like some apps and things of that nature that can prevent cell phones from being used while the person is driving. But that, again, depends upon, first of all, that the person is actually going to be willing to use that and is not going to turn the app off, which quite often is a problem there as well. So we continue down our list of our hierarchy of controls. The next thing we go to is kind of the fail-safe of the administrative controls. We look at those policies, those procedures, the company policies, the laws in public safety, if you will. And we're going to look at the effectiveness of those as we move further a bit in the presentation as well. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't implement a corporate cell phone policy as one of your first steps. In fact, if you don't have a distracted driving policy, you need to get one in place. A great place to start with that is with the National Safety Council. There's a free cell phone policy kit available online from the National Safety Council. Just go out to their website and get that, and it will help you to not only craft your policy, but also, frankly, to help sell this upstream if you have to do that as well. But again, don't think that that's going to be the be-all and end-all, if you will. Just because you have a policy or procedure in place doesn't mean everybody's automatically going to follow it. I saw this picture online a few years back. It's a Washington, D.C. Metro driver who was driving a bus and texting with her phone in her lap. She was doing that, quite obviously, to avoid detection. One of the passengers on the bus actually took the picture and reported the incident. Next, we go back to our hierarchy of controls again. The next one is kind of the personal protective equipment approach. And I guess you could technically throw in things here like airbag seatbelts, although that's really not doing anything to prevent the accident or incident from happening. That's more protecting us from the impact of it, if you will. And then we would have other, and that other is frankly where we're going to spend the bulk of our time looking today. Now, certainly there's a lot of problems associated with this, and if we stop and we begin to think about the different types of distractions that we have, excuse me, the first type of distraction that I would suggest that we have would be a visual distraction. Just looking at something other than looking at the road or the task that we're doing there. Now, I'm on the road at least a couple of days of just about every week of the year. Most of this work's out of state, so I'm almost constantly in a different rental car. As you can imagine, that means my truck is at the airport about 90% of the time, but also it means that every time when I get in a different rental car, I have to do certain adjustments before I get rolling. And I'm having to make sure that things like the mirrors are set properly. So that's a part of that whole visual process, making sure that I've got everything set in the vehicle as well. Also feeds into one of the other distractions that we'll talk about in just a second. We also can have things which are auditory in nature that can distract us, hearing something that's not related to driving the vehicle. I'm a musician. I play in a couple of bands, and I'm constantly listening to music, picking out parts to sing and or play. So it's very easy for me when I am driving to get lost in the moment, lost in the music, if you will, and have one of those auditory distractions take me away. And the idea that this is something that could distract us is really nothing new. If you go back into the 1930s when we had these newfangled AM radios that were being installed for the first time in cars, you remember those real high-def AM radios? Many people expressed their concerns over this dangerous distraction. And ironically, by the way, your hearing is one of the senses that you never really turn off but yet it's very easy to have those auditory distractions. Third on the list of different types of distractions that I would suggest is a manual one. And I mentioned some of this earlier with things like adjusting mirrors. It could also be things like adjusting the GPS, the climate controls, the radio, other things you've brought into the car and things of that nature. So certainly that's one of the things that can cause us to be distracted as well. And then finally I would mention as the last type of distraction that we could potentially have, that would be what I would call a cognitive distraction, where we're thinking about things other than the primary task at hand, which is driving the vehicle. And that one is probably much more of an issue than many of us really realize, to be honest. So visual distractions, auditory distractions, manual distractions, and cognitive distractions. And we see these on a day-to-day basis as we're driving. We can see those in other folks, and quite frankly, we can often see them in ourselves. We also, unfortunately, see them in accident reports as we go through. The situation, the accident that you see portrayed here on the screen happened in Missouri back a few years back. The NTSB, after compiling its report, said that it was clear that the pickup truck driver, and that is the pickup kind of in the back of the semi and underneath the bus there, if you will, was manually, cognitively, and visually distracted. The one that they left off the list there was the auditory, and that one's not built into the NTSB reporting system from what I understand, so very well could have been that as well. But as we look at that, they identified at least 3 different areas, 3 different types of distractions that happen there. And as they look at that, by the way, in this particular incident, there were 2 teenagers who were killed, the 19-year-old driver of the truck and also a 15-year-old who was on the school bus at the time of the incident. But the driver of the pickup had sent and or received 11 texts over the previous 11 minutes. By the way, at the time of this incident, Missouri had a law in place that banned texting by those under 21 years of age, which would have obviously included the 19-year-old driver of the pickup. However, we find that many people, and I would suggest it is regardless of age, don't necessarily follow the rules, follow the laws, follow the procedures, if you will. And if you think about that, we've gone out and our natural response in many cases to things like this is to come back and to institute a policy, to institute a procedure or a rule or law. And if you think about it, we have here in the U.S., we have texting bans in place for just about every state. It's only down to 2 states now that don't have texting bans. And we go out and we think that that's going to stop everything, but it doesn't automatically. We think, okay, well, with the cell phone itself, let's go to, maybe we just have hands-free only, and that's the way to do that. But the problem is, when you think about something like a handheld phone ban, we don't just drive with our hands. We're driving, quite frankly, with our minds more so than that. We're driving with our eyes. We're driving with our ears. And when we get our eyes, mind off the subject that we're doing, the task that we're doing, if you will, which is actually driving, then our focus shifts. There was a study by Transport Canada that was cited in an SC white paper back a couple of years ago that talked about the concept of inattention blindness, where we focus our eyes when we're both not on a cell phone and on a cell phone. It's really, really interesting study to see how that folks diverted their attention, if you will. When we're not on a cell phone, you can see as indicated by the red box there on the screen, we have a nice field of vision, if you will, that we are scanning as we're looking forward as we're driving. But what do you think happens with that when suddenly we're on a phone, even if it is a hands-free device? It's really very surprising to see how much the field of vision reduces down. It's incredible, actually. We stop scanning as much as we were. We begin not to look around. We focus in more on the mental aspect of the phone call than what we do the mental aspect or the physical aspect of doing things like scanning the road ahead while we're driving there. So we look at things like the laws, the rules, if you will. We come back, and this is probably one of my favorite ones of all of the things that we talk about as far as the rules, the policies, and procedures, but particularly with the laws here. And that is the young driver restrictions, rather. And a lot of states have these now, including my home state of Alabama. And it's so interesting to me because it's as though we think, well, okay, when somebody gets to be 21, 22 years of age, then suddenly they can text and drive safely or be on the phone safely and drive. But it just doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So you see, we try all of these laws, all of these policies, all of these procedures, but they're not having the impact that we hope they would. They certainly have some impact, but we've got to move and look beyond that. And you know, the interesting thing with this now as well is it has moved beyond just the idea of people walking and texting, or driving and texting rather, or driving and talking on the cell phone, to where it's now become an issue where people are having just a huge problem that people are texting while walking. In fact, this year for the first time, the 2015 version of the NSC injury facts that just came out a while back includes stats on cell phone distracted walking. And you can see the numbers here. Over 11,000 injuries that they tracked over a 10 or 11 year period there that were related back to people who were walking and either looking at their cell phones or talking on their cell phones. And it's just amazing. We see these numbers continuing to go up time and time and time again. Year after year, we see these numbers continuing to rise. In fact, they've become just a huge issue, and particularly with young folks, but not just limited to young folks as well. There was a study that I saw recently by a group called Safe Kids Worldwide. They went out and actually did observations on students as they were crossing crosswalks or crossing public streets around their schools. And they were looking specifically at high school students and middle school students. Children or young adults really, in the ages of 16 to 19, they found that the pedestrian injuries among them had increased over 25% over the past 5 years, and now that over 50% of all the pedestrian deaths for all age groups were among teenagers ages 15 to 19. And when they looked at what these folks were doing as they were crossing the streets, 1 in 5 high school students were demonstrating a distracted behavior, a distracted walking, if you will, behavior. And 1 in 9 middle school students were displaying this. It's become just such a big, big issue now. And you think about that. Where are these folks going to be in another 5, 10 years? They're going to be in our workplaces. Do you think that trend or those behaviors that they're acquiring now, if you will, do you think those are likely to continue when they get to our offices, to our plants, to our factories? It's a huge issue that we're seeing more and more with not only the idea of people driving while they're distracted, but also, frankly, walking while distracted. In fact, kind of ironic, I saw this the other day from the Twitter universe, I guess you could say. Most of you are familiar with Ryan Seacrest. He posted this the other day, and it says, when I'm texting and walking, I can't hear anything anyone says. I need someone to physically guide me around. Most of you probably have seen him before on things like American Idol, and you hear his famous exit phrase, which is Seacrest out. Hope he has somebody to guide him around when he is texting and walking, or they could take on a whole new meaning, couldn't it? If you think about it, it's just a big, big issue. And so the natural response, again, is to come back and to do what? Well, let's come up with another law. Let's come up with another procedure or policy. In fact, in the state of New Jersey, saw recently that they are proposing to make it illegal to use a cell phone while you're walking. Similar legislation has been tried in other states but failed to pass, and who knows if this one passes in New Jersey or not. But my question would be this. Is it simply enough to institute a law, a policy, or a procedure? Let's do a little quiz real quickly for everyone. If you would, think for your activities over the past month or so. How many of you, including those of us who are the safety professionals here on the call today, how many of us have driven at least 10 miles over the past month on a major highway, major interstate, or some major highway? As you think about that, let me ask you this, and just be honest with yourself here. Obviously, this is kind of anonymous at this point, but if you would, how many of you drove the speed limit as you were driving along on that highway? Usually when I do this presentation at conferences, I usually have somebody typically in the front row that will giggle and look up at me and say, oh, at least, as in I drove at least the speed limit. And that's the case for many of us, quite honestly. Otherwise, we would have no need to have signs that look like this that tell us not only what the speed limit is, but also what we're actually driving. In fact, here in Alabama where I live, my brother-in-law is a state trooper, and he tells me that kind of the unwritten law is that if you're, about 10 under or 10 over the speed limit, law enforcement's probably not going to bother you. They're going to give you that little bit of a grace period, if you will, there. But you get over about 10, 11 miles over the speed limit there, then suddenly, as he would say, we may have to have a little talk. So certainly we know that we've got a little bit of fudge room, and most of us, quite honestly, tend to take advantage of it. Let's talk about another law that's out there. In every Canadian province, every state in the United States except for one, it's a law that you have to wear your seatbelt. The one state, by the way, that does not have the seatbelt law in place is New Hampshire, and you can see what their tag says there, and you can insert your own seatbelt joke there with live free or die being the state slogan. Every year, though, we have to have a campaign for click it or ticket, because although the law is in place, although the rule is there, not everybody always follows the rule. And that's my point when it comes to distracted driving as well. Even though we're passing these laws, it doesn't mean that everyone is always going to follow the rules, if you will. In fact, how many of you recognize this lady? This is Maria Shriver Kennedy Schwarzenegger. I would really hate to see her business card. It's bound to look like one of those checks from the golf tournaments, if you will, with her name as long as it is. Here she is, busted by the paparazzi, talking with a handheld cell phone. This is back when her then-husband, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was the governor of California, and he had just recently signed into law the bill that banned handheld cell phone use. So even the paparazzi caught her doing that. So not everybody follows the law. Not everybody follows the rules. Some people will try to even hide it when they try to use a cell phone now if they have a hand-free device. In fact, what we find is quite often they begin, instead of holding it up high where everyone can see it, now they'll hold it down in their lap, which becomes even a bigger distraction now because they're looking down as opposed to looking up. In fact, it became such an issue in the province of Alberta in Canada, they came up with a slogan and had to come up with a media campaign to combat this. It was called Crotches Kill. You can insert other jokes there if you'd like, but we're going to leave that one alone. Another thing that would come along with this as well is things that we think about the type of enforcement that we have. In Iowa, for example, they came to the conclusion, and this is from the Sioux City Journal, that having a law in place banning texting, but it was only as a secondary offense, was not very effective. And we see that as well in many, many other surveys and studies as well. I ran across a study recently from the University of Alabama, Birmingham School of Public Health. In one of the doctoral theses for one of their doctoral candidates, they looked at data for the 10-year period of 2000 to 2010, and they compared 24 states which had texting bans, 7 with the young driver bans, and then those states that had no bans in place whatsoever. But they also came back to that idea that I mentioned just a moment ago, the type of enforcement that we have, secondary versus primary. Can they pull you over for being on the cell phone, or is it they have to pull you over because of something else, and then they can cite you for that as well? And the study was very, very interesting. It did note that in states where texting bans were in place and there was a primary enforcement part of that statute, that there was about a 3% decrease in the number of deaths, about 19 lives saved per year that they calculated. Also, they calculated that there was about an 11% decrease in the age group of 15 to 21 in the states where young driver bans were in place. Now, I'm not dismissing this. I'll take the 3%, quite frankly, but I want more. If one of those 19 lives were one of my family members, one of my coworkers, one of their family members, a friend of the family or what have you, certainly I would be rejoicing that this has been in place and it's potentially saved their lives. but there's a whole lot of other folks out there that we're not touching with this. And so that's what I want to get into next and start thinking about how do we combat these. We mentioned kind of the universal things that distract us earlier. Let's dig a little deeper into some of the more interesting ones that we see that are actual distractions that are out there. Erie Insurance Group did a survey back in a couple of years back that looked at the top 10 driver distractions. And I'm not going to read through every one of these, but as you look at the list there, think to yourself, okay, I may not use a cell phone while I'm driving, but how many of these other things have we seen or had happen to us or have we done while we're driving? Look at number 6 there, eating and driving. How many meals do you think we've all had out of a paper sack driving down the interstate at 60, 70, 80 miles an hour? The numbers are just amazing for most people when we talk about that. In fact, we've even developed, as one of my coworkers would say, we have developed the list of what we would call good car food and bad car food. You know, certain types of food that you can eat without making a mess in the car, others you just forget about it. Don't even try it, right? So you think about that list. That's just the bottom of the top 10, if you will. Here's the others as well, numbers 3 through 5. Other people in the car can be a distraction. Reaching for something that you brought into the car, like a GPS, CDs, MP3 player, whatever there. Outside events, people rubbernecking. That's a favorite of mine. The wreck on the other side of the interstate, and everybody on our side has to stop because of that. Causes more accidents. What do you think the top 2 driver distractions were? One of them is usually fairly easy for everyone to identify, and that would be obviously the cell phone, either texting, driving, checking email, whatever it is. But the position of it in the 1-2 order, if you will, of the Erie survey was really, really amazing to me. They found it came in at number 2, followed by, really overwhelmingly, the idea that we just get distracted by getting lost in our own thoughts at times. We daydream, if you will. We're so focused or preoccupied with things that are going on around us that we literally just zone out, if you will, and we don't realize what's going on around us. Now, let's bring this back in and start to apply it to some of the concepts that we use. And I'm not here today to try to sell you SafeStart. That's not the intention. But SafeStart is the process that I'm obviously much more familiar with. You may have other processes that you use to address behavioral type issues or awareness in general. But what you need to do is find a way to use those terms, use that technology that you're using there to come back and to combat this issue of distracted driving. And don't think that just a rule, policy, or procedure or the public safety laws are going to protect everyone from this, because frankly, I don't think that it's going to. We've got to go beyond and address the root issue here, which comes back to some of the unintentional and sometimes some of the habitual at-risk behaviors that we see. We're talking, and when we look at the concepts that we talk about, we're going to take these and apply them back to driving. Let's think for a moment about these 4 errors that you see at the bottom of this. Things such as eyes not on task, mind not on task, not looking or thinking about the task that we're doing, certainly applicable as we think about distracted driving. And then we think about things such as line of fire and or balance, traction, or grip. And you say, well, what's balance, traction, or grip have to do with that? Well, the traction could not just be the person. It could also be, by extension, the vehicle that we are driving. We make one or more of those 4 errors, if you will, when we're in one or more of these 4 states. And let's think about them real quickly. Rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. I can tell you I had to drive over to Atlanta, Georgia yesterday. I had to drive about 1/3 of the way around the loop in Atlanta, Georgia, and I frankly don't like driving in Atlanta. I can tell you I saw all 4 of those yesterday, not only in other people's vehicles, but frankly, I saw them in mine at times as well as I was driving along as well. So you think about those 4 common states that we see. It's so common that we see them all the time. Let's think about them, defining them a bit more here as we start out. Let's look at rushing real quickly. Sometimes we think about rushing just in terms of going fast, and that's not just what we're talking about here. We're also talking about, or mainly talking about, honestly, those times we're going a bit faster than we normally would go. I'm always amazed by the idea of driving 10, 15, 20 miles an hour over the speed limit over just a short distance. How much quicker are you really going to arrive there? 30 seconds? 45? Maybe a minute? How many of you ever seen someone that comes rushing past you as you're driving down the highway, and they nearly run several people off the road as they're cutting in and out of traffic, and then you go off the off-ramp, and where are they? Just one or two cars ahead of you, caught by the same light getting off the interstate as you were, right? But rushing can also be another thing, which is multitasking, and we see things like this behind the wheel all the time. I actually saw someone a while back who was shaving driving down the highway. And I'm not talking about this guy was shaving with an electric razor. I'm talking about full lather, razor, everything. I don't know how the cleanup worked on that one, but he was going to town as they're going down through there. Let's think as well about things like frustration while we're driving. Boy, we've all seen that from time to time. And if you're looking at the other driver and just to make sure that he sees your displeasure, if you will, or maybe you're trying to make sure he sees your hand signal as you're telling him he's number one, then, well, maybe you don't have your eyes and mind on the task that you're doing there, and you could make one of those errors. Then we think about it, although we don't tend to think about this as a distraction, it certainly can be, though, and that is the idea of fatigue. How many times have we driven when we're just having those long blinks, we're starting to doze off at times? How many times have you personally either fallen asleep or nearly fallen asleep at the wheel? It's not as though we have to go sound asleep, if you will. Sometimes it is just those really, really long blinks, and quite frankly, it doesn't have to be the really long distances either that can get us. And then finally, I'll mention this one, the idea of complacency. If you think about complacency, it is one of those things that attributes, I think, to a lot of the driving errors that we see. If you think back to when we first learned how to drive, we were so focused on how we were driving. Our hands were locked in at 10 and 2, 9 and 3. We didn't want the radio on. We didn't want anyone in the car speaking to us. We were focused on the highway. We actually even used our turn signals back then. Think about it. We were driving and we were focused in on the task. Part of that was because we knew our skill level wasn't exactly where it should be initially there, but also because we were hyper aware, if you will, of the hazards that were around us. One of my fellow consultants with SafeStart was telling me the other day about the first time that her daughter drove through the traffic in the heart of Atlanta, and how that she was locked in on driving. She was so focused as she was a teenager driving through there. And as she drove through the heart of Atlanta, they got to the other side, and she said, "Mom, I need to stop for a minute." She said, "Why do you need to stop?" She said, "I'm exhausted." And just that short drive through town and all of the traffic, she was so hyper-focused, hyper-aware, if you will, that she was literally just worn out from doing that. She said she rode with her now adult daughter through Atlanta a while back. And as you can imagine, it was quite a bit different. And see, that's what happens to us. We get accustomed to it, whatever it is, and we begin over time, the time we spend with a hazard, our awareness level goes from being kind of hyper-aware, if you will, to begin with, to where suddenly, well, we reach a place where we call it the first stage of complacency. Some people call it a habitual behavior or habituation, where quite honestly, we are no longer preoccupied with the risk, and our mind can start to wander. And then we actually reach a point where we are so comfortable with the task that we're doing that we reach the second stage of complacency, and we are no longer even thinking about the risk unless there is some form of external stimulus that brings us back to the moment. Apply that to driving. That could be the horn from the driver in the other lane that you nearly bumped into. It could be the rumble strips on the side of the road, if you will. And it's easy to see how we can become distracted by something, and this complacency sets in as we're going through that. Now, if you think about that front of that car there, that state error pattern, we call it, that's really kind of the cause of a lot of the distractions and a lot of the distracted driving that we see. For example, as we look at this card, what percentage of distracted driving incidents do you believe would be represented by the state error pattern I'm about to show you? Think about the idea of rushing, including the concept of multitasking, combined with complacency, which in turn then causes us to take our eyes and or our mind off of the task that we're doing, which then in turn causes us to be in the line of fire. I would suggest it's probably a staggering number, a staggering percentage that could be encapsulated in just that state-to-error pattern that we talked about there. Give you an example that I saw a couple of years back. I live in a real small town here in rural Alabama. We've got a grand total of 3 traffic lights. That gives you an idea of how small our town is. It's kind of like living in Mayberry, if you will. I had gone out with my wife on a Saturday morning. She had just recently at that time had back surgery, so she had lifting restrictions, and every weekend when I would get home from being on the road, I got to be the muscle. So I got to carry the groceries in, carry this around, move this, move that, that type of thing. We had been to the grocery store that Saturday morning. We're coming back into town to the main intersection of town here. We're in the little red car there right outside of McDonald's, and we're cruising along. The light is red for us, and I am just coasting to a stop behind the white vehicle that you see just ahead of us there. And as I'm coasting to a stop, I glance back over to my left, and as I'm glancing back over to my left, one of the things that I noticed, first of all, is coming off of the cross street, there is a blue car that is making a right-hand turn, and they're going back the direction that I just came from. They're headed back towards the grocery store, if you will. The second thing that I notice as I'm looking back to the left is I see there's a large black truck that is leaving the gas station. And the guy in the black truck, he's got his left hand on the steering wheel. His right hand has the cell phone in his hand, and it's a fairly animated conversation that's going on. As he pulls up to the edge of the road there, I saw him as he glanced back up to his left, right in front of me, and although I didn't have the opportunity to talk to him, I could almost hear his thoughts, if you will. He looked up, and I think he looked at the red light itself, and in his mind said to himself, there's no cross traffic, the light is red, so I don't have to worry about anyone crossing the intersection right now. It's good for me to go ahead and pull out and go into the turn lane. He was actually turning back to the left to go back the direction the blue car just came from. So as I'm sitting there and I see all of this unfolding in just literally split seconds, my first thought is, oh boy, there's about to be a crash that's going to happen. And when that crash happens, there may also be a secondary crash. It's going to involve a little red car that I'm quite fond of. Now, I didn't want them to hit me. Obviously didn't want them to hit each other either. So I laid on the horn. A couple of the other folks there in the intersection saw what was happening. I heard a horn from behind me, for example. The driver of the blue car checked up. He recognized what was going on. I don't know if he saw it automatically or if he heard the horn or a combination of that. Didn't get a chance to talk to these folks because the incident didn't happen, obviously. The driver of the black truck, though, I don't know to this day if this gentleman knew what nearly happened because the cell phone never left the right ear or his right hand, continued talking, pulled right out into the turn lane there as though nothing had happened. Now, that represents a bit of what I would call a part of the cure, if you will. We talked about the problem or the cause, if you will, of some of these distractions that we have. Here's a piece of the cure. And this is what I would call what we call the critical error reduction technique skills that we develop over time, including looking at others for the patterns that increase the risk of injury. Now, looking at that situation with the driver of the black truck, do I see that state-to-error pattern with him? Certainly. I began to see that he was rushing, multitasking. It appeared he may have been a bit frustrated, maybe a bit complacent as well, and obviously that led to think about the errors, the eyes and mind not on task, and in turn that put him and the driver of the blue car and potentially others around him in the line of fire. So that's a bit of that cure there. We've got other techniques we talk about here as well, things like self-triggering on the state or the amount of hazardous energy, analyzing close calls and small errors so that we prevent agonizing over the big ones, and then working on habits as well. And if you begin to use things like this to develop good safety-related habits and develop good safety skills in general, then I believe we can combat this idea of distracted driving. At this point, I'd like to turn back over real quickly to Kyle. Kyle, we can begin to take some questions at this point if you would like.
Great. Thank you, Danny, for that wonderful presentation. Before we get to the questions, I want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey I mentioned at the top of the hour. The survey should be appearing on your screen now, and we ask that you consider completing the survey to let us know your thoughts. Your input is important because it directly helps improve future webcasts, so I do hope you take the time to fill out the survey. If you don't see the survey on your screen, please make sure your pop-up blockers are turned off, and you can also access the survey by clicking the survey button on the lower right hand of your screen. Let's get into some questions, Danny. We had some questions here regarding off-the-job driving, and one individual says, it makes sense to have an off-the-job driving safety initiative, but what about at a company where no one drives as part of their job? How do they get management on board to focus on something that doesn't have a direct impact on the workplace?
That's a really, really great question, and I hear that quite often. For many companies, they begin to think, well, we don't have drivers, if you will. And I guess I just made the little air quotes there, although you can't see that. But we often think, well, we don't have company drivers. We don't have people who their primary job is driving. But are there secondary roles that they have where they do have to drive? For example, most companies have at least one or two outside sales reps who are out on the road sometimes on a consistent basis, many times working out of their homes as well and just coming to the office occasionally. So certainly that's an area of opportunity there. Quite honestly, we see a lot of the executives and managers and supervisors that are out, maybe out going to meet with a client, maybe going out to meet with a vendor, going out to take their department or some of their coworkers to lunch, and some of those could be determined to be business activities. It could also even include things like someone who has to run to the post office or to drop something off after hours at a FedEx or UPS type box or something of that nature, an overnight thing. So there's a lot of different areas that I think many people don't realize they do have people on the road, even when they don't have a traditional driver, if you will. So I think a part of that is sitting down and really looking at what the exposure is there. And quite honestly, I saw another question that was on here earlier as well, Kyle. I think it may be number 2 there, that talked about trying to promote driving awareness, but nobody really thinking that there was a problem there. And I'll be honest, I've seen this before with a lot of managers and supervisors, particularly, quite honestly, the ones in the C-suite, that they don't perceive that there's an issue and they don't want to do anything about this because, well, who do you think's probably on the phone as much as, or if not more than anyone while they're behind the wheel? Well, quite often it is our folks that are, the driver, the executives of the company or the sales management of the companies at times as well. So I see a lot of resistance from that. I think it just comes back to looking at not only the kind of the moral obligation there, but also, frankly, the legal obligation that you have and the potential exposure that you have as you look at the risk management side of this as well.
Well, it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about here is awareness training for behavioral change. Should that be where the focus is on, where the focus is less on perhaps the specifics of cell phone use and more just on awareness training and changing people's behavior regarding being aware? As you notice, policies and laws don't really change much if people don't follow them.
Right. Yeah, the policies, rules, procedures, those all have their place. But at the same time, we got to realize that they don't always, they don't accomplish as much as we wish they would. I guess would be the best way to say that. If you think about this, where do we go? Do we just say, okay, well, we did our part, we've got a policy in place? Well, that doesn't really change the behaviors or up the awareness level, if you will. So I think it does come back to trying to boost the awareness level, and specifically by trying to work on some safety-related skills. If you think about the idea of, we talked earlier about people who are texting and walking or on the cell phone and walking, how they've got the mental and or physical distractions there as well. Even though they're not driving a vehicle, certainly there is potential hazardous energy around them. And it doesn't have to be out by the roadway. They could be walking down the halls or walking down the stairs. I saw one university, it was somewhere out west, it was in USA Today just last week, where they were actually designating an aisle in their hallways and on their stairs for students who were preoccupied with their cell phones. And they were designating those as texting aisles, if you will, including going up and down steps. And I'm thinking, wow, look at the hazardous energy around you as you're just walking up and down steps there. So I think it is a very, very important thing for us to come back and begin to think about, how do we up the awareness? How do we get people recognizing that there is an issue there and just how distracted they are and what they can do about that? Personally, one of the things that I do is I just, I turn the cell phone off a lot of times when I get in the vehicle. One of my coworkers says he just takes his and puts it in the trunk. That way he knows that there's no way he's going to be distracted by it. But again, you keep in mind, as we talked earlier, there's a lot of other things out there that can distract us as well.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because, as you said, you can put the cell phone in the trunk of the car, but you can't put things like advanced cruise control in the trunk of your car. You can't put, your GPS necessarily in the trunk of the car. And these are other electronic devices. How much do they distract drivers, even though that they're perhaps meant to aid the driver by telling them where to go, by providing, stability control or cruise control so they don't have to worry about, changing their speed too much. How do these other electronics in the vehicle or other driver aids, do those contribute to driver distraction as well?
I think so, and I'll give you a personal example, and maybe I'm just kind of the techno goob here, I don't know, but I remember the first GPS that I bought. As I was driving around, I was just driving locally here where I live, where obviously I didn't need the GPS. I knew exactly where I was going. But as I was driving along, I found myself, instead of watching where I was driving, where do you think my eyes were most of the time? I was watching the GPS. I mean, it was so unbelievable how distracting that was initially. But even beyond that, it's very, very easy for us to just, even if it's just momentarily, take our eyes off of the road. If you think about it, if we're traveling at 70 miles an hour down the interstate, we're driving about 100 feet per second. And so if we take our eyes off the road just for a brief moment to look at the GPS, maybe we wouldn't answer the cell phone, but it rang, and so we wanted to at least see, who it was that called. Okay, we look down. 1, 2, we look back up. About 2.5, 3 seconds usually for that procedure. Insurance studies that I've seen tell us that the average distraction is about 4.5 seconds. So you think about that, anywhere from 2.5 to 4.5 seconds, we've just gone a football field to a football field and a half. And that's straight line. That's not thinking if we veer out of our lane or something like that. And you're right, it doesn't have to be the cell phone. It could be the GPS. It could be, a distraction from somebody else in the car, which, again, that's not going to be outlawed. Even if we just looked at the laws as being the solutions, we're not going to say, okay, everybody's got to ride solo now, or you can't ride with your kids in the car, you can't adjust the air conditioner in the car. So there's a lot of different things that distract us. So it does come back to me to just upping our overall awareness and developing those good safety-related skills.
Now, in parts of the presentation, you mentioned, handheld versus, wireless or Bluetooth. Are those devices safer than handheld phones? Bluetooth and wireless devices?
In theory, yes, or we think that way anyway. But the idea, I always come back to, what are you actually driving with? Are you driving with your hands, or are you driving with your mind? And we're obviously driving physically with our hands and our feet, but really and truly we're driving with our minds more than anything. And so when we get onto those calls, it's very, very easy, or even if we're returning using like a speech-to-text type device, if we're preoccupied mentally with that, forget the physical side of it. There are a lot of things mentally that are distracting to us there that are taking our eyes and our mind off the road there. So, yeah, they're a bit better, but I still think there's a lot of danger involved with that as well.
Okay. Now, for some of the safety professionals on the call, what can they do to, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but perhaps go into a little bit more detail, how can they approach this subject with the company? How can they go to their superiors and talk about the need to implement a distracted driving policy, and what can they do to make sure it's thoroughly written and will be effective?
Very good. A great place to start, and I'm just plugging the National Safety Council here a bit, but I would again suggest you start with the National Safety Council's website as far as the potential written policies and procedures. There's a wonderful cell phone kit. It's free to download there. It walks you through some presentations as to how you can present this to management. It also helps you lay out and craft your policies and procedure. It gives you some draft policies and procedures there. But again, it's one of those, you're obviously going to need to run that back through your HR group and your legal group and all of that to go through and make sure everything's covered there. I would encourage you as well, don't just limit this to cell phones. I would encourage you to look at distractions in general and try to reach out and try to touch that as you're writing these policies. But also, again, don't think that's going to cover everything. You've got to come back and find the ways to address more of the awareness level instead of just saying, okay, well, we got the problem solved because we got the policy or procedure in place.
Okay. Now going back to one of your slides where you note that complacency, it's decreased awareness over time. What are your thoughts on advanced behind-the-wheel driver training? As one of our viewers notes, most drivers probably haven't had any training since they were 15, 16, 17 years old. So is this something important that society should do or workplaces should do, which is to implement more advanced behind-the-wheel driver training, just kind of reinforce some of these hazards and the idea of awareness?
I think that's a great idea as well. It's one of those, I don't think there is any one solution to say out there, but we've got to try the multifaceted approach, just like with the laws and the policies and procedures. We know that that's a part of the puzzle, if you will, but we also have to come back and look at things like the behaviors and or the awareness level. So anything that you can do that's going to bump up the awareness level is going to certainly help. Having someone perhaps that, we're doing like an advanced driver awareness type process, and perhaps you've got someone that's a ride along, if you will, doing kind of an observation, if you will. They can not only point out the deficiencies there, but they can also reinforce a lot of the good behaviors that are there and give the positive feedback there as well. And I think that's a really, really important piece of this process as well.
Okay, great. We have time for just one more question. You mentioned, again, some policies that companies might have. Do you know what percentage of companies might have a no texting or no cell phone usage policy versus those that just have a hands-free policy? This attendee has expressed concern about the danger of requiring people to pull over to make a call. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Kind of two-part answer here. First of all, I don't have the stats on how many companies have the hands-free versus no cell phone policy. I'm not sure if that's available through the council or not, but we can check and see if we can find that for you. Actually, I think that would be a really interesting proposition to look at. As far as when some companies require, if you do have to take a cell phone call, that you do pull over to take that. And certainly there are some inherent dangers in that, particularly if you're on the side of the interstate or if you're in a kind of a rougher area of town or whatever. I've also heard that some companies have exemptions in their policies that are built in for emergency situations. And I know I've seen some state laws that have some of those built in as well. So it's one of those, I don't know that I have the great answer for that, but I think that's one of those you have to work through very carefully and try to find the answer for. Sorry, that's not really a solid answer on that, but I don't know that there is a real solid answer there on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I know there were a lot of questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, and I apologize. But rest assured, all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded on to Danny. Once again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey on your screen to give us your feedback. And that ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Danny, SafeStart, and all of you who listened in. Thank you and have a great day.